G'day, I'm Oscar Trimboli, author of How to Listen, and the best and worst advice I ever got was from my father. Oscar, you can't always be the smartest person in the room. You can always be the hardest working, though.
Ooh, that's that's tough advice from Dad. When did he tell you that, Oscar?
I can tell you exactly where I was. We were on a concreting site. We were building a factory, and I was 8 years old. My school holidays were spent on building sites, collecting money from all the site workers and going and getting their lunches. Typically, it was a sandwich at a local store and bringing them back. If I was lucky, I got to keep the change. If I was unlucky, I had to give them the whole change back and earned nothing from it. My dad believed that teaching his kids a work ethic from a really, really, really young age was important. And when I came back from school holidays, I was always confused about people talking about going in caravans and camping and to the beach. What were these mythical places? I was tuned in to the sounds of hammers, concrete mixers, and the rhythms of building sites. And it wasn't till I was 21 till I visited my first beach as an Australian. So that was unusual.
Wow. Wow, so you were an early tips only waiter. That's interesting, huh?
That's a good way to think about it. And you learn to be a little creative. Most people, their home language was not the language spoken on the job site, although it was a lot of broken English. There were Italians, Croatians, Greeks, there were Yugoslavs, there were Polish people. It was a really, really broad spectrum of folks. And when I wasn't collecting money for lunches, I was collecting wood and taking the nails out of formwork. So that taught me that effort will get rewarded. But if I wind the clock forward to my second job in the workplace, I was working really hard, Phil. It was a Saturday night, and I got to know Amir really well. Amir was the security guard in our office, and it was 11 p.m. and it was a Saturday night. And Amir scratched his head and he says, "I'm a security guard. I'm paid to be here. You're probably not getting paid extra." And I said, "Amir, you see that light on over there in the Accenture building? There's one person who's still working." My dad said, "You can't always be the smartest person in the room, but you can be the hardest working. I'm going to outwork them." Amir came back at 3 a.m. and said, "Oscar, you're still working." He says, most of your friends are out at clubs and enjoying their Saturday nights, or maybe they're just asleep." And I said, "Amir, you see that light over there? I'm going to outwork the person who works at Accenture." And he said, with a huge, generous laugh, he says, "Oscar, you do realize they've just left the light on." And in that moment, I realized that being the hardest working in the room, sometimes you might need to be the smartest in the room too.
There's a tender balance, right, between smart and hardworking. So good.
Yeah,
Well, good you found it.
I think both are relevant. I think the skill is choosing when it's appropriate.
There you go. Absolutely. So was it then that you got started listening and teaching yourself how to listen, or when did this fascination with listening begin?
I think you need to zoom into April 2008. I was in a boardroom setting a budget with a group of people, 18 people across three continents, Sydney, Singapore, and Seattle. It was the Microsoft budget setting process for the fiscal year. And these meetings are renowned for going over time. Typically, they run, well, they're scheduled for 90 minutes, but they could run up to 3 to 4 to 5 hours because the budget has to be set in this meeting. And I can still remember the day because there'd been bushfires around the office and it got into the air conditioning system. So smell is a really potent memory trigger for most of us. And as I think about being in that room, and there was this huge debate going on at 20-minute mark. My vice president, Tracy, looked me in the eye and said, "Oscar, I need to see you immediately after this meeting." The only thing going through my head, Phil, is how many weeks of salary have I got left? Because Tracy doesn't say that. I'm probably getting fired. Now, I didn't pay attention to anything that was being said from the 20-minute mark on. I was on a piece of paper, just trying to figure out how many weeks of salary. And miraculously, the meeting finished at the 70-minute mark, 20 minutes early. Wow. And I tried to get out, and I went towards the door as everybody else left. And Tracy said, Oscar, make sure you close the door when you come back. I thought, great. And as I stepped back towards Tracy, she said, you have no idea what you did at the 20-minute mark, do you? And I thought, great, I'm getting fired and I don't even know why. And I sat in the chair. I looked Tracy square in the eyes, and she said to me, Oscar, if you could code how you listen, you could change the world. And Phil, I don't know about you, in that moment of profound listening on Tracy's part, the only thing going through my head was, woohoo, I've been fired. I like all that listening stuff she was talking to me about was just blah, 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 blah. And the only thing I could blurt out, and this is important when you think about what you say to somebody and what they're hearing. She said, if you could code how to listen, you could change the world. The only thing I was hearing was I hadn't been fired. So sometimes you need to know that what's on people's faces and what they're thinking is very different to what they're saying. And what I blurted out was something really basic. I said, Tracy, do you mean code or code? And she said, code, Oscar. We work at Microsoft, code it. And I thought, now, here's the problem with this meeting, Phil. This profound moment of listening, because I wasn't listening. At the 20-minute mark onwards, I got a 32% uplift in my budget line rather than a 13, 14, 15% uplift in my budget line, which I typically get. So not listening has consequences for your budget sometimes. So in that moment, that's how listening started. And 2 weeks later, the Chief Financial Officer, Brian, asked me to come and audit his listening in the next meeting, which was pushing the budgets out to all the Australian geographies. And I said, Brian, you've been talking to Tracy about this listening caper. I haven't got time. I've got a 32% uplift in my line. He goes, Oscar, I can't fix your top line, but I can invest for growth. And I said, Brian, what time is the meeting? Where should I be? Because as a sales leader, if people want to invest for your growth, you're there. And as I watched Brian in this meeting, I started to notice the length of his questions, how often he interrupted, how many people were being invited to contribute to this meeting. And then I went, as I was writing all this down, I realized I started to code listening. And I've been coding listening ever since, Phil, whether that's quizzes, 3 books, podcasts, jigsaw puzzle games, you name it. We've got all kinds of ways to help people how to listen.
Wow, that's so interesting that would happen at a point when kind of you weren't listening. You were expecting to be sacked. So, that moment obviously changed the trajectory, but did it change your attitude as well about listening, or did you just, keep going on the same path?
I think what was profound to me was the way Tracy was listening to me. The way I was engaging in that meeting was no different to the way I engage. I've worked for Microsoft for the best part of 12 years. And I was very famous for one simple phrase. That's a great hypothesis. Tell me what the customers say. So at Microsoft, they were renowned for intergalactic PowerPoint presentations from market research firms summarizing everything they did in focus groups. But I was taught the truth is always with the customer. The truth is always with your prospect. And I was fortunate. A lot of people wanted to work on my team. And I'd always say to them, look, before you come, tell me about a customer conversation that you had. And a lot of people at Microsoft will go, well, I don't talk to customers. I said, well, go and listen to some contact center recordings and tell me something different. So no matter what people would say, I would always say, have you been listening to the customer? But I didn't realize that's what I was saying. And back on that job site, way back when I was 8, starting to learn how people were expressing themselves when their language wasn't their home language. Somebody asking for a hamburger or somebody asking for fish and chips in broken Polish probably sounds exactly the same. but I started to learn about body language in those days as well. So I think that thread, Phil, had always been there in my life, but Tracy shone a spotlight on it and said, this is potent. This can make an impact. And I came to realize, why did I never struggle recruiting when people always said there was a talent shortage? Because I was always listening for people's motivations, not just what they wanted from a role. Why did our business development teams succeed where others maybe didn't? We built new businesses inside Microsoft. That was my special sauce. I built a business that was merging telephones and IT together, as an example. And we were told we would get nowhere. We had no hope. Cisco was the 800-pound gorilla. And what I did was I formed a really interesting partnership with Cisco rather than treat them as a competitor. And again, I remember Peter Hughes from Cisco saying to me, wow, we don't get many people from Microsoft coming into our office. We always have to go to theirs. And, in those moments of just taking a little bit of extra time and making the investment up front around listening, your impact is multiplied. It reduces a lot of extra work, but it also helps you to form a human connection in a way that others aren't. And it's a point of difference. From that point where Tracy said, code how you listen, I engaged with my dad said. I couldn't be the smartest person when it came to listening, but I could be the hardest working. So I started to review academic literature. I started to try and find courses on how to listen. There weren't many, but the ones that did exist in Australia, I was all over. So from that point on, I became the hardest working in the room. And hopefully now I've come to realize the more I study listening, the less I know.
That's interesting, right? That's so interesting. On a sales team, learning to listen, sharing how to listen, and partnership, that connection is one that, I do my best to teach all my salespeople that how to listen. But often I'll say, well, you have to pay attention to what they say. But you argue in the book that it's not about paying attention; it's about giving attention, right? Or that they're different. So talk to me about that, Oscar, because that stopped me in my tracks. When I read that, I'm like, oh, stop. Have to think about that one some more.
Yeah, I want to be clear. Neither is correct or incorrect. You need to notice when it's appropriate to pay attention and to give attention. Paying attention is an obligation. It feels like a form of taxation. You have to do it, and you're required in that moment. And, when you're listening to the steward on a flight and they're going through the pre-flight announcement, you're probably paying attention. You probably have to. But when you give attention from a place of generosity, from curiosity, and you're completely present in the moment. Now, I just want to point out, neither is right or wrong. It's when is it appropriate. People know when you're giving attention, and people equally know when you're paying attention. And then, more importantly for most people know when you're distracted as well, when your attention is flying somewhere else. Now, Wellington Airport in New Zealand is between two islands. It's at the southern end of the North Island of New Zealand, and as a result, there's a huge airflow that comes through in between the islands. It's one of the most difficult airports in the world to land on. And in 1993, we were coming into land at Wellington Airport, and there were 2 aborted attempts. And then the captain makes an announcement. Please give your attention to the flight crew. This is our last attempt. We will need to make an emergency landing. Well, Phil, in that moment, I'm taking the card out of the back of the chair in front of me. I'm giving it my complete and undivided attention. I'm looking to the left and to the right. I'm trying to find where the nearest seat is, behind me, in front of me. And when the steward got on to make the flight announcement, I can guarantee you everybody on that flight was giving their complete and undivided attention. Now, the thing with giving attention is it's the 20%, not the 80%. When you bring your presence and give attention, you'll change the way the speaker expresses their idea. And in sales, what you will do is you'll change the way the speaker explains a problem in a business context, and you'll probably get them to start to explain not just the problem, but how to socialize the business case for approval internally. I think good sellers listen to problems, and great sellers help the client with the business case to get the approvals done. And when you give attention, you start to notice not just what they say, you notice how they say it, and then most importantly, you understand what they haven't said. What they don't say is more important. It's more influential and it's more potent than what people say. So if you just focus your attention on giving it to what they say, you're missing out on about 86% of what they're thinking.
So how do we pick that up, Oscar? How do we flip that over and work that to our advantage? Is there some technique or is there a practice that we can do so that we can stand a better chance? Because I gotta tell you, 14% doesn't sound like a puncher's chance to win a deal.
Well, it will give you some odds. When you know the neuroscience of listening, if you know these three numbers, you can quickly work with the three questions I'm going to suggest you could explore to unpick what they haven't said. So the three numbers, 125, 400, 900, this is words per minute. 125 words per minute is the average workplace English speaking speed. So I speak at about 100 words per minute. I'm a little slower than most. Phil, you're closer to 150 when you speak, but on average, we're about 125. That's the speaking speed in a workplace. Phil, right now, while you're listening to me, you can listen about 4 times faster than I can speak. You're listening at about 400 words per minute. And in that gap between my 125 words and the 300, you can jump ahead. You're solving, you're anticipating, you're jumping to conclusions, you're getting distracted. There are all kinds of things that are going on in the mind of the listener. But just like comedy and sex, the value of listening sits with the audience, with the other person, not with you as the listener. So this last number is the most important one to listen to. If you're going to write down anything from this discussion, it's this number. If you remember only one thing about our conversation today, it's this: the speaker can think at 900 words per minute. So think about them at 900 words per minute. That's their thinking speed. And if they work in collaborative, competitive, conflict, or resource-constrained environments, they could be thinking up to 1,600 words per minute. Yet they can only speak at about 125. So it means the first thing you hear could be anywhere between 5 to 14% of what they think and what they mean. Now, if your pipeline is lumpy in the middle, this is because you're not listening to what's not said. If you're consistently losing to one particular kind of competitor, it's because you're listening only to what's said and not to what's not said. My invitation to you is when you notice what they haven't said, you'll change the way they speak, not just to you, but to others who are socializing what you're trying to sell as well. So I give you 3 really simple questions. But before I do, Phil, what's going through your head when you think about these numbers?
Well, 900 is a pretty big number. You know, thinking speed, right? If I'm thinking about multitasking or things, I mean, I can do a bunch of stuff because you're slow. You know, to your point, you're at 100, so that means I can think 9 times faster. It means that I have to slow down to hear what you're not saying, even more to get at the real meaning of what you're saying. That's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah. So let me give you a dirty little secret, everybody, when it comes to listening. It's not your job to make sense of what they say. It's important, but it's not your job. If you can help them to say what they think and what they mean, you'll have a completely different relationship with that person. Listening will be light and easy rather than draining and distracting. And they'll refer you because they'll say, wow, Phil's got awesome products, solutions, and offerings. But you know what? The way he listened to me, he heard things I've never said before to anybody out loud. And as a consequence, rather than selling being only your effort, when you listen this way, your customers and quite possibly prospects you never ever sell to become the greatest source of referrals for you. I have another, I call Phil a client. Phil's in Singapore. He's a chief information officer. And about 6 years ago, Phil was asking me to do some work with him and his organization. And about 20 minutes in, Phil, I said, Phil, I'm the wrong person for this outcome. I know the perfect person I can refer you to. And the meeting was shorter, and I introduced someone else to Phil. And Phil rang me up about 3 months later. He says, I've got to thank you. You were spot on. You weren't the right person for this outcome we were trying to achieve. And the way you listened to what I really wanted, because what they said initially wasn't what they actually needed, that's powerful. And that's where we left it. Phil has become my biggest source of referrals in any of my client base. He has never paid me a single dollar in business, and yet he has made me more money than any marketing, any sales technique, any kind of other client referral, because he said I was clear not only about what I did do, but I was even more clear about what I didn't do. So when you listen this way, you change the way the speaker communicates their idea. Meetings are shorter. Hallelujah. Who wouldn't want that? And they have more impact. So let me give you 3 really simple questions to think about when it comes to listening for what's not said. The first thing I would say is know the difference between open and biased questions. If your question is more than 8 words, your question is likely to be biased. That doesn't make it correct or incorrect. You just need to know that's the intention of your question. So for many of us, we ask biased questions when we should be asking open questions, and we ask open questions when we should be asking biased questions. So here are the 3 questions. Please make them your own. Don't be robotic and use the identical phrase I'm about to use, and I'll give you some examples here. The first one, imagine you have a listening compass, and a compass can set a direction for north and south, east and west. The first question is going to be a north-south question. This is designed to continue to listen in the same direction. It is designed to listen for similarity. We're going to show you an east-west question that is designed to listen for difference. Most people don't realize that questions have direction. And when you understand not just the direction of the question, but how to use it to unpack what's not said, you'll change the relationship with the person you're working with. The first question is simply this: tell me more. It's going to keep the conversation going in the same direction and allow them to fully explore what they haven't said. Now, the way I say it is, wow, that's fascinating. Can you say more? Still less than 8 words. So the direction we want to take people in is north-south. There will come a point in the conversation, and typically if you're halfway through the conversation, an east-west conversation to explore difference is important. The question is simply this: and what else? This will move the conversation in a different direction. When you say, tell me more, they're going to continue down the path they have. And what else will get them to explore in a slightly different direction. I'm wondering if you've thought about anything else. That's how I would say it. My point is simple: make it your own. The third is the most powerful, the most potent. Done well, it's intimidating. Sorry, done well, it's inspiring. And done poorly, it's intimidating. When you use this phrase, you will completely change the way the speaker expresses their idea. Here it is. Now, don't worry, nothing froze. What you need to understand is that silent and listen have the exact same letters. And if you can become comfortable with a pause and realize when they have finished their breath, they haven't finished their thought. So those 3 tips and questions are: tell me more, and what else, and silence. Now, Phil, I'm speculating. These may be difficult for you, especially the last one.
That's so interesting, Oscar. I've worked really hard on the pause. I've worked really hard to get better at that, but it is very hard for that. It's very hard to just shut my mouth and allow things to sit, right? To allow things to come forth sometimes. So why is that, Oscar? Why is that so hard?
Ironically, it's not hard in high context cultures. The Inuit of North America, the Eskimo, Chinese, Korean, Japanese cultures, the indigenous cultures of Australia, the Polynesian cultures of the Pacific, the Maori cultures, the Amazonian tribes. High context cultures value the relationship over the transaction or the task. In the West, we use these phrases called pregnant pauses, awkward silence, deafening silence. It's hard because we don't realize there's a third position in the conversation. We think there's a speaker, we think there's a listener. And the third position is the dialogue. It's like a dance. There's 2 people doing the dance, but it is a dance. Now, if you can listen to notice both positions, pausing and silence will be a very liberating place, not just for you. I think, Phil, if you just slightly change your orientation to go, the pause is hard for me, and you move that and you go, the pause will help shorten our conversation. The pause will help the speaker say what they think and what they mean. The pause will help us understand, are we a good match or not? The pause is a space we should invite because it's also a place that you can recharge your listening batteries. It's a place where you can recharge your thinking. It's a place where most of us feel compelled to fill the silence. Why? Because that's what we've seen other people do. It's not right or wrong. Don't get me wrong, inappropriate pause can be just as brutal as an inappropriate interruption as well. So there's an element of judgment. But my invitation, Phil, is just move your thinking ever so slightly, 5 degrees, and not the pause is hard for me. The pause is helpful for the speaker in our conversation, and I think that's where you'll move to more often. One of the very simple tips we provide in the listening quiz is if you are one of the 4 archetypes, you're the interrupting listening villain, that when they take a breath, just count 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000 to yourself in your head, not out loud, and you'll be surprised what else you may hear from the speaker in that moment. Don't get me wrong, decades and decades of watching people jump in and fill the space, it's hard to understand there's another way to do it. But what fills me with confidence is these really high context cultures. Silence and pause in those cultures is a sign of wisdom, respect, and authority. And I think as sales professionals, we want to be perceived as wise. We want to be perceived as an authority. We want to be respected as somebody who brings gravitas and seniority to the conversation. Sometimes the pause could just be, I'm just reflecting on what you said. If you give me a moment. And this is not necessarily a technique I use, but it's a signal I send to the speaker to help them realize what they've said is profound. Now, be careful when you use this. Don't do this in the first meeting with a client. Otherwise, it'll be perceived as false flattery. But if you're in a second and third conversation and the relationship's a bit more advanced, that technique is just as potent as saying, could you just give me a moment? I just need to make a note of that. And all of a sudden, the speaker goes, oh, I didn't think that was noteworthy. Or, wow, they're taking notes. This conversation's a little different to one I have where somebody's just talking about a product at me. Now, I'm curious, Phil, of those three techniques where you say silence is the most difficult for you, what's your version of a north-south question, and do you have a version of an east-west question to get people to think differently?
Well, tell me more. We teach TED questions, so it's tell me more, explain to me, or describe to me. So I like that one. Those three seem to be good, and I've stolen Michael Bungay Stanier's and what else as well. So I like that, and now it's from you as well. So two people that I have mad respect for. With that though, I don't think I do enough of the and what else. And so that's something that I know that I need to work on, because that's the only one that I can come up with, Oscar, was the and what else. And like I said, I frankly don't use that enough. So I need to, that'll be one that I need to practice.
And the way you can adapt that question, if and what else isn't appropriate, it's and who else. So a really good east-west question is, in the second half of the meeting, Phil, I'm just curious, if we think about and who else might be involved in this project, who else will be involved? Oh, well, actually, and all of a sudden they're describing a political roadmap to you, they're describing an approval process, they're describing a whole bunch of things. So, and
that strikes something with me. Yeah. So I like to, when now that you say the who, I like to say, so tell me who would be left out, who would feel left out if they weren't involved.
Yeah. And your question there is a beautiful example of a biased question. Even though it's short, it's still biased because you're implying that they are left out because we haven't discussed it, as opposed to them aren't being left out because our internal processes will do that. It's a really useful question. And if your design is to prompt them, absolutely. And who else is involved? And who else will be left out as a result? Because we can't get to everybody, right? And then the question I would ask at about the 45-minute mark in a 1-hour meeting, roughly you want to be asking this question at the 70-minute mark. And you can insert the following phrases for this question. So you could say CEO, CFO, shareholders, suppliers, media, employees, competitor in this version of the question. Phil, we've covered a lot of ground today. If the owner of this business was listening to our conversation today, what's the one question you know they would have asked that we haven't even covered off? Phil, if your most important shareholder was in the room right now, what's the one question they would have asked that we haven't even covered off? Phil, when we think about our most cynical employee, the one that's always asking the right question the wrong way, what's the question they would be asking us right now that we haven't even covered off? Phil, I know you operate in a highly regulated environment. If the regulator was in the room right now, what would they be disappointed that we haven't covered off? Now, this moves the locus of focus from internal and the dialogue to external. And all of a sudden, you start to unpick what's not said. I was working with a pharmaceutical client. I asked this question about highly regulated markets, and they just stopped and they said, I have to think about that. And I let them just be in the moment. And the group, there was 4 people in the room besides me, they turned to each other and said, what would they say? And for 5 minutes, they were having this fierce debate about something we hadn't even covered off in the meeting. Now, I know nothing about pharmaceuticals or engineering or any of that stuff. And then they came back to me and said, how did you just, we've never talked about that. How did you just do, can you teach us how to do what you just did? And I said, sure. But what I'm curious about is you've landed on this one thing, which was they were going similar. They were listening for similarity. They were into groupthink. I want to speculate with you that there's at least 2 other things your regulator's concerned about that you haven't even covered off, right? I had no idea, but typically I know there's roughly 3 things. And again, vast debate. They ended up coming up with about 6 things. And these are 6 things the regulator had gone through in their previous audit that they didn't actually move forward. And in that moment when they said, okay, well, we have to make a decision. Thanks, see you later, goodbye. I thought, I'm never going to have any work from that organisation. They went and bought from my competitor in that case. And 2 months later, they rang me back and said, look, we made a mistake. We went with somebody who was just playing back what we'd said to them, which was north-south, listening for similarity. We need someone who's going to listen to us in a completely different way. And that's what we keep coming back to. We kept telling this global consulting organization, that's not the question Oscar asked us. It's like, I wasn't even in the room. So when you design your thinking to help them express their ideas in a different way, you'll be memorable. You'll be a trusted advisor, whether you win the business or not.
Wow, that's super interesting. That's super interesting to think about. And I'll be re-listening to that, Oscar, because that's pretty cool, man. That's pretty powerful. So
And Phil, just tactically as a sales professional, that question is a super qualifying question. That question is designed to take the lumps out of the middle of your pipeline so it flows nice and smoothly. If you've got a pipeline that looks like it's got a bulge in the middle, you're not asking these kinds of questions. You are living in a world where you think every opportunity is a problem that you and your organization can solve. And the best thing you can do for the majority of those opportunities that are stuck in the middle is refer them to somebody who can actually solve the problem that they have, and you will win more business as a result.
which is ultimately what we all want. And that's really good. So Oscar, I know we could send people to your website, right? We could send them to oscartrimboli.com. We could tell them get a copy of How to Listen, which they certainly need to be able to do. Pick that up on Amazon. Great book. But Oscar, if they want to get started on the listening journey and they want to get started listening more effectively, so they can take some of those lumps out of their pipeline, so they can be better, where do they get started?
If you go to listeningquiz.com, we've got a very short 5-minute quiz that you can take. And at listeningquiz.com, you'll get a report. It's 5 pages long. It's got 3 tips tailored to your listening biases. And you can start the journey on how to listen differently. So when it comes to connecting, I'd rather you connect with your listening rather than connecting with me. Don't get me wrong, I'd love to connect with you, but I think most of us don't understand the 5 levels of listening. And at level 1, just listen to yourself is the starting point, and why we recommend you taking the listening quiz.
Wow. Listen to yourself first. Awesome advice. Folks, go to listeningquiz.com, take the quick quiz, get a copy of How to Listen. Oscar Trimboli, you are fantastic, my man. You were even better than I had hoped. Thank you so much for all your insight and for letting me listen with you today and to give you my attention. Thank you.
Thanks for listening.